Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite a set of sources today, plunging us right into, well, a really contentious area.
Yeah, it's that intersection of cultural change, immigration, religious interpretation, all focused on recent commentary and interviews out of the UK.
It's definitely fraught territory.
That's right. Our main source material is excerpts from a pretty high-profile YouTube interview. It's with Tommy Robinson.
Okay.
And he's laying out his arguments about Islamic history, immigration, and crucially, his claims about the Quran itself.
Yeah.
Well, it's provocative stuff.
Which is why our role here is really just to guide you, the listener, through it all. We need to be impartial.
Absolutely. The goal is just to distill the core argument, from claims about cultural shifts and integration issues to the really nitty-gritty theological points about interpretation. Things like abrogation.
And we have to stress, we're maintaining strict neutrality here. We're reporting on the arguments and the facts as presented in the sources, not endorsing any political viewpoint. We're just here to understand the debate.
Right. So, okay, let's start with the big picture claim. Robinson kicks off by saying there's a huge cultural revolution happening right now in Great Britain.
Cultural revolution? That's strong language. What's the shift he's pointing to?
Well, he argues that people who were maybe afraid to voice certain opinions before, they are not scared any. That's his phrase.
Okay.
And he frames his own activism and the events he's involved in as being, pro-identity for Britain, for free speech, general terms.
But there's an underlying focus.
Yes. The sources make it clear that the unspoken but understood undertone is really concerns about Islam.
Right. And that leads directly to a key question raised in the interview, doesn't it? About multiculturalism.
Yeah, basically. How can a Western country be multicultural without, and this is the phrasing used, allowing people who don't have its best interest at heart to overrun it?
That frames the problem very specifically around intent, doesn't it? Not just difference, but actual intent.
It does. And Robinson backs that up with a comparison. He says, quite bluntly, if there were no Islamic immigration into Britain, there'd be no debate to even have.
He contrasts that with other groups.
Yes. He holds up Jewish, Sikh, and Hindu communities as examples. He claims they've successfully assimilated, integrated, work hard, embrace this nation. That's his bench.
So the argument is that successful integration is possible and has happened.
Exactly. But then he draws this really sharp line. He says a specific section of the Islamic community is different. They're not here to integrate, but, quote, here to dominate.
Saying they declare war instead of love. That's a very strong...
It is. And it frames the integration issue not as a failure of policy or society, but as a deliberate antagonistic choice rooted in ideology.
Okay, so to make that argument about intent more concrete, the narrative seems to shift from these big ideas to very local personal experiences.
Yeah, it drills right down into his hometown, Luton. Mm-hmm. That personal connection, that's where the anecdotal evidence comes in. Yeah. It's used to sort of fuel the argument.
And he highlights an interview with a Muslim woman from Lubna.
Yes. He says her experiences mirrored his own observations about community breakdown.
And her stories are quite specific, according to the source. She apparently said her school days were like everyone was integrated apart from the Muslims.
Right. But it goes deeper than just, kids sticking to their own groups.
How so?
Well, the source quotes her claiming her son, who's under 11, so we're talking junior school, was apparently told by other Muslim kids not to talk to non-Muslim children.
Why? What was the reason given?
Because according to the claim, the non-Muslims are going to burn in hellfire and are worse than us.
Wow. I mean, that kind of exclusion, allegedly being taught that young, that's a really powerful anecdote for his case.
It is. And there's more. Lubna also apparently recounted being 16 in a religious class, and a Muslim man stood up and just declared, "We're at war, Muslims, non-Muslims."
A declaration of war in a classroom setting.
That's the claim. So you take these stories, the alleged declaration of war, the kids talking about hellfire, this observation Robinson makes about a Muslim playground, non-Muslim playground, and you put them together.
And the argument being built is that this isn't just social awkwardness or natural separation. It's presented as segregation driven by a specific hostile ideology.
Precisely. Which brings us to the next logical step in the argument. If the problem is deliberate, why? What's driving this alleged ideology of non-integration?
And that's where we move from the sociological evidence, the anecdotes, into the realm of theology, right? Into the text itself.
Exactly. And this is where it gets, really complex. The core of this part of the argument rests on how you read the Quran. Robinson talks about what he calls his prison revelation.
Okay, unpack that for us. What happened there?
So this was apparently back in 2010 or 2011. He's in solitary confinement. And he says he decided to go through the Quran, specifically looking for verses that forbid friendship with Christians or Jews.
Just those verses?
That was his focus, yeah. And he claims he found pages of it. He says this exercise was what made the jigsaw puzzle fall into place. His conclusion was The text itself mandates this separate.
Okay, but hang on. The common counter-argument is always that the Quran also contains many verses promoting peace and tolerance. How does this source account for those? How can both exist?
Right, and that leads us straight to the absolutely crucial theological concept that Rafi Pinsky brings up in the source material, abrogation.
Abrogation. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's the doctrine known as naskh in Arabic that basically says a verse revealed later in time can supersede, change, or even completely cancel out an earlier verse, even though both verses might still be in the printed text we read.
So it's not just about which came first, it's about which one holds ultimate authority. The later one overrides the earlier one.
That's the core idea of abrogation. And the argument presented in the source ties this directly to the historical context. They argued that the verses revealed early on in Mecca, when Muhammad and his followers were relatively weak and, needed to coexist peacefully. Those verses are argued to be abrogated, superseded by later verses revealed in Medina.
Medina being when the early Muslim community had gained more power, an army.
Exactly. When they were powerful enough to, as the source puts it, take over. So the peaceful verses are framed as strategic for a time of weakness, canceled out later by verses reflecting a position of strength.
That link between the interpretation abrogation and the political or military power of unity at the time, that seems to be the absolute crux of their argument about the text true.
It really is. It suggests the peaceful message was temporary, condition.
And this interpretation underpins the whole methodology of Robinson's book, which the source discusses.
Yes. He claims his book takes the Quran and reorders it chronologically, putting it in its right order based on what certain Islamic scholars and historians supposedly recommend.
And the claim is that this reordering changes the fundamental message.
Correct. By reading it chronologically and applying the principle of abrogation, they argue the overall narrative shifts away from peace towards political and military dom.
The source then tries to give this chronological reading some historical backup, mentioning figures like Churchill and Gladstone.
That's right. It's used to suggest that this correct rooting, this understanding of the true message isn't new, that influential figures understood it long ago.
What are the specific claims?
Well, they cite Winston Churchill, alleging he read the Quran this way and concluded Islam could take Europe back to the Dark Age, and even more pointedly, William Gladstone, the former prime minister.
What about Glad?
The claim is he held up a Quran in Parliament and declared something like, "There'll never be peace on this earth so long as we have this book. It's a violent and cursed book." These are presented as historical endorsements of their interpretation.
Okay. And the book itself tries to visually represent this, showing verses canceled out.
Yeah, the source mentions the formatting. For example, a peaceful verse, like one cited as 76.29, might be shown with a line through it.
Canceled.
Superseded by a later, more aggressive verse, like 9.5, the sword verse. Robinson apparently claims his book highlights 100 verses that just talk about rape, murder, and death against non.
So the visual and structural argument of the book is designed to hammer home the point. Read chronological with abrogation, the final message.
That's the assertion. It's arguing the problem isn't just failed integration. It's a text that, according to this reading, actively commands non-integration and hostility when Muslims are in a position of strength.
Okay, so bringing that theological argument back to the present day, how does it connect to the claims about society? It
reinforces that initial claim about places like Luton. The argument is repeated. Society can't continue if you can't even find basic interaction, a Muslim hanging out with a non-Muslim, in these areas. It's presented as a sign of this mandated separation act.
And then they bring in demographics to add a sense of urgency.
Exactly. The interview cites specific data points. They claim the Muslim community in Britain is currently 6% of the population.
Okay.
But crucially, they add that it's doubling every 10 years. That growth rate is key to their argument.
And that demographic projection is then linked direct to societal problems.
Immediately. The source lists a whole catalog of issues attributed to this growth. Jihad, all the rapes, all the problems, all the crime, all the hostility, all the heroin. It's a very direct and quite alarming linkage being made between population growth and societal ills.
Yeah, that's deliberately connecting stick fear on a grand scale.
And the security angle is presented as the sort of final piece of the threat assessment. They quote these really jarring figures.
What were they, Deb?
40,000 Muslims are allegedly on the UK's terror watch list. And that number is then contrasted with the size of the UK's armed forces, only 70,000 persons.
That comparison is clearly designed to shock, pitting the number on a watch list against the entire military.
Absolutely. It's engineered for maximum impact. And it leads directly to the final question they pose. What happens when that 6% becomes 26%?
The implication being, if things are this bad now, they'll be unmanageable later. Action is needed before that growth happens.
That's the clear message being pushed. Now, this is important because the final part of our source material offers a counter perspective.
Okay, good. From the YouTube host interviewing Robinson.
Yes. And it adds a really necessary layer of nuance. While the host seems to agree that there's a serious problem, He calls the ideology in places like Luton cancerous and agrees decisive action is needed.
So he acknowledges the problem on the ground.
Does. But, importantly, he completely rejects the idea that the entire Quran should be written off based on Robinson's interpretation.
So that's the key distinction. He separates the observed problem from the conclusion about the text itself.
Precisely. The commentator argues the issue isn't the book per se, but a specific narrow interpretation, essentially, Islamist, that has twisted it. He points out that, look, millions of Muslims worldwide practice forms of Islam that are livable, that do allow for coexistence and adapting to local cultures.
Does he give examples of these alternative coexisting forms?
Yes. He lists several to make the point that Reformation and diverse interpretations are already a global reality. He mentions Bektashi Islam in Albania,
Okay.
Sufi Islam, which you find in Turkey, Nigeria, India, Iran, various branches of Shia Islam like the Alawite. And he points to the way Islam is practiced by huge populations in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Asia.
So the argument is, if millions already live peacefully with this text, interpreting it different, why conclude the text itself is inherently the problem?
Exactly. The commentator's position is that the real enemy is the specific political ideology Islamism, which has promoted the most corrupt and perverted interpretation.
Which leads to a very different call to action.
Completely different. Instead of demanding radical policies based on demographics and a chronological reading, this perspective suggests the focus should be on encouraging and supporting reform within the Muslim world, to inspire the Muslim world to reform their religion, leveraging these existing examples of peaceful coexistence.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, we've really explored two opposing viewpoints here, haven't we? Both starting from a concern about integration failure, but leading to vastly different conclusions and proposals.
Yeah, on one side, you have this narrative of imminent cultural breakdown, driven by a reading of the religious text using abrogation and chronology that claims it mandates conflict when adherents are strong. And that leads to calls for pretty radical policy changes.
And on the other side, you have the argument that, no, the problem is ideological, it's Islamism, not Islam itself, that the text can be reformed, can be interpreted for coexistence, just as millions of Muslims already do around the world.
And the hope is that what really stands out for you, the listener, is how much this entire intense debate pivots on that one theological concept, abrogation.
Right. Whether those later verses truly cancel the earlier peaceful ones, and crucially, whether the cancellation is tied to the context power versus weakness, that seems to be the fundamental point of divergence.
It really shapes everything else.
Which maybe leaves us with a broader thought, something that goes beyond just this specific discussion. If you look across history, across different cultures and philosophies, how often do we find foundational texts, religious or otherwise, that contain guidance that seems, well, contradictory?
That's a great point. Guidance for peace alongside guidance for conflict, perhaps.
Exact. And the provocative question for you to consider does the context, specific time, the place, and maybe most importantly, the power dynamics of the group doing the interpreting, does that context ultimately dictate which part of the contradiction wins out? Which interpretation becomes the one that's axed and lived by?